And now on ABC, we cross to Martin Place, Sydney, for the Vietnam Veterans March.
To viewers to the 288 ABC television stations throughout Australia, thank you for joining us. Good morning and welcome to the national telecast of the Vietnam Veterans Welcome Home Parade, coming to you live from the city of Sydney on this magnificent morning. The march today commemorates the 25th anniversary of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. Australian men and women were there for 10 long years until December 1972. And then, in an awful irony, when we did get out with the last of our men, it was under the cover of a Gallipoli-style deception plan involving dummy drops and simulated activity. It was Anzac Cove all over again. But at least, in a great tradition, our boys were home for Christmas. 50,000 Australians served in Vietnam, to be exact, 50,001. And by general consensus, they were perhaps the finest troops, soldiers, sailors and airmen, ever dispatched from these shores. Well over 30,000 of them were regular Army career soldiers. In Vietnam, 496 Australians were killed, 2,398 were wounded. And today the Australian nation pays honour and tribute to the high courage, the loyalty and the tenacity of those men and women in this Vietnam reunion, this much-delayed welcome home from Vietnam. I'm Clive Hale, and with me three commentators, all Vietnam veterans. First, Major Peter Young, a member of the most highly decorated unit, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, by courtesy of Channel 10. And with Peter, Wing Commander Bob Howe, who served with 2 Squadron Canberra bombers in Vietnam. And also with us, the current captain of one of our major fighting ships, HMAS Brisbane, a Vietnam veteran herself at present alongside Garden Island, Captain Robert Walls, who served in Vietnam waters in HMAS Hobart. Good morning, fellas, and welcome.
Good morning, Clive, and this is a day I think we've all the Vietnam veterans have been waiting for a very, very long time. We've got wonderful weather, and I think it's going to be a very, very memorable day. What do you think, Bob?
Yes, indeed, Peter. Good morning, everyone. It looks like great weather for the march, and I would also suggest for sailing. Don't you think so, Rob?
Indeed it is, Bob. Good morning, Peter. Good morning, Clive. And a warm Navy, Army and Air Force welcome to all our ABC viewers.
Right, well, it'll be a few more minutes before we actually join the parade, so as we wait, let's turn the clock back to recall the men and the mood and the deeds that were the 1960s when all we celebrate today began.
It's a Monday morning in the Republic of Vietnam. You're listening to the Dawn Buster on the American Forces Vietnam Network.
Stands a boxer and a fighter by his trade, and he carries the reminders of every blow that laid him down or cut him till he cried out in his anger and his shame, I am leaving, I am leaving, I am leaving. La la la, la 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 la. La la la, la 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 la, la 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 la
Take me on a trip upon your magic swirling ship. My senses have been stripped. My hands can't feel to grip. My toes too numb to step. Wait only for my boot heels to be wandering. I'm ready to go anywhere. I'm ready far to fade into my own parade. Cast your dance and spill my way. I promise to go under it. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy and there is no place I'm going to. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In a jingle jangle morning, I come following you.
Do you think these young servicemen should be going to Vietnam?
I don't disagree with it. Sending the young lads to fight. I think this should be a professional soldiers' war only.
I have a son that is in the National Corps, and he'll probably go in time, and I'm a widow, and he's my only son. And therefore, I've got a face to say, why should everyone else?
I don't think it's fair at all. We need them over here, not over there. We weren't called over there. Why do we have to go? We're really only sticking our beak in.
When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we'll see. No, I won't be afraid. Oh, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Stand by me. If the sky that we look upon should tumble and fall, or the mountain should crumble to the sea, I won't cry, no, I won't shed a tear, just as long as you stand by me.
And welcome back to the streets of Sydney on this Vietnam Veterans Reunion Day. We're waiting now just for the leader to the march, who will be the blinded and disabled Vietnam veterans.
While we are waiting, Clive, it's interesting to see that on this saluting days we've got the highest authorities in the land paying tribute to these men. And in fact we've had messages from overseas that I do in fact here have a message from the President of the United States, President Reagan. He says, "The national reunion of the Australian Vietnam forces presents a welcome opportunity to honour the sacrifice and achievement of those who fought to defend the freedom of Vietnam and Southeast Asia from communist aggression. 4 times," he says, "this century, Australians and Americans have joined together to safeguard our precious liberty by force of arms. We pray that we've seen the last of such fighting. But more than that, we pray that we will one day live in a world where every nation is home to the freedom and justice that have been our birthright." As Australian veterans marched through the Sydney city on October the 3rd, he said, they will be joined in spirit by America's veterans and hailed in tribute by the American people. And he ends by saying, "Please accept my congratulations and best wishes."
We also have a message here from, of course, the Prime Minister of Australia, Bob Hawke. who writes, on the occasion of the Australian Vietnam Forces National Reunion and Welcome Home Parade, Sydney, October 1987, I should like to convey to Australia's Vietnam veterans my own and our nation's best wishes. This special commemorative event enables all of us to reflect on the significance for Australia of our 10-year involvement in the Vietnam War. Although all Australian forces were withdrawn from Vietnam 14 years ago, Vietnam may never, in a sense, be withdrawn from the lives and minds of many of our veterans and their families. There is, of course, no denying the fact that the Vietnam War was one of the most divisive and disturbing issues in Australia's history. But equally, whatever our individual views on the merits of Australian involvement, all of us acknowledge the courage, the dedication and the sacrifices of our forces in Vietnam. In that conflict, they demonstrated once again the traditional valour and professionalism of the Australian services. To our Vietnam veterans and to all who participate in the commemorative reunion in Sydney this October, I should like to say personally and on behalf of all Australians that we share a sense of pride, gratitude and respect for you and your fallen comrades. You've honoured us with your deeds and with your sacrifices, R.J.L. Hawke, Prime Minister of Australia.
And whilst we're waiting, it might be interesting to know that this whole march was organised by the diggers themselves. There were no generals involved. In fact, of course, there was a patron, that's General Sandy Pearson, who gave them the cover. But the whole thing was organised by the diggers themselves, who were in Chicago in 1986. And they saw there a march which was organised for the return of American veterans. And I was told there was something like 100,000 Americans lined the streets as some 20,000 American veterans marched to the streets of Chicago. Now, they brought that back. And a public company was formed which consisted of 32 of them. And once all the formalities were completed, they went to the RSL and they found an enormously helpful ally in Sir Colin Hines of the New South Wales branch of the RSL, who I think perhaps personifies the bridge between the older soldiers, the older diggers of World War II, and this new breed of Vietnam veterans. And the RSL in New South Wales offered every accommodation, and they've given them an enormous amount of support. I think the man who's really been the driving force has been Peter Polton, who's there up on the days today with the Prime Minister and the senior officers who come out to pay tribute. And we've got Chairman Jack Mitchell, Secretary Pat Curtis, Treasurer Jack Thurger, and John Trevelyan, and John Preston, who's done all the entertainment, and Charles Wright, Public Relations. It really has been a wonderful thing because the momentum picked up on this parade right from the beginning. And from all over Australia, we've had these heartwarming stories of people phoning in from various places. I'm hitching down from Cairns. And the government came in, they provided money, the states provided money, and the services provided service transport. And we're also getting stories of people who booked their tickets, but finding out that some of the disabled were travelling on those service aircraft and giving up their tickets so that the disabled could travel in comfort, and they in turn took their place on the service aircraft. It really has been a grassroots thing organised by the diggers themselves, and it's something which we're all of us looking forward to enormously.
And of course, there are a great number of Americans who will be marching this morning here in the parade. They've come over in their many hundreds.
Well, that's the nicest thing about it. We've not only got Americans, we've got South Vietnamese, we've got Koreans, and I believe we've got a few Thais. But one of the nicest things today, Clive, is that I'm not the youngest of the lineup of diggers. We normally have an Anzac Day. I'm happy to say we've got two other veterans with us who also served in Vietnam. In fact, it'd be interesting, Rob, where did you serve in Vietnam?
I served in the Hobart. She was the first of our destroyers deployed up there. We had to change our ensign, I remember, in March 1967 before we went north. Changed from the old British one and put on the Australian one and proudly went away. We served in Operation Sea Dragon up in the northern part of the Gulf, supported the carriers. We provided naval gunfire support in South Vietnam and came back with a rather interesting set of experiences. Fortunately, we took no damage and no casualties.
Oh, that's good, as long as you brought them all back. What about you, Bob?
Peter, I was at 2 Squadron, which served in Phan Rang. It was on the coast in Vietnam. I guess from an airman's point of view, we have to point out that Vietnam itself is about the same size as a drive from Sydney to Melbourne. And if you can imagine a strip 50 kilometres either side of the Hume Highway, that was Vietnam to us, and so it's a very small place. So I served in Phan Rang, which was about 100 kilometres north of Saigon. 2 Squadron itself had a long history of fighting in First and Second World Wars, and we moved up there from Amberley. Myself and my crew moved up from Amberley in 1969, and I spent 1 year in Vietnam until May 1970.
Well, one of the most important things, I think, is that whilst the men were up there, we had so many of the wives sitting patiently back home. And I think today we're also paying tribute to the wives who were, I think, well looked after by the services. The services had an extremely good organisation which swung into action to look after them once the menfolk went away. But of course it's all now becoming popular. We're getting more and more books on the subject. We just had the excellent book on the team by I.G. McNeill. We're getting a variety of books written by people who were there. We've got books on Longtown, and we just had a recent book came out which showed the enemy's point of view for once. So I think this is fairly good. But we are getting quite a lot written on it.
Right, exactly. Well, for example, there's a book by Stuart Rintoul, Australian Voices. People can fully understand what it was like for our troops, our men and our women over there. Ashes of Vietnam, which ABC Enterprises has asked me to mention if possible. And Stuart Rintoul is the author. He's a journalist who lives in Melbourne. The research for his book took him all over Australia into the homes of scores of veterans, and many of whom, in speaking to him, told their horrific stories for the very first time in this book, Ashes of Vietnam, Australian Voices. From enlistment or conscription, arriving in an alien land, the horrific consequences of modern warfare. Australia's forgotten soldiers tell their side of the story. It's a powerful and sometimes, as I said, horrific exploration of the numbing brutality that is war. It's an intensive, moving testimony that speaks with the voices of those who've survived, thanks to Stuart Rintoul's work.
Well, it's good to see then, of course, Vietnam itself went up and down like a yo-yo, basically, around the year 1968. 1968, as everyone will remember, was the year in which the North Vietnamese mounted the Tet Offensive. Now, there's been a lot of argument by the historians as to actually whether they won, but the main thing is they demonstrated there and then that they could win that battle on the television screens back in America and the other Allied countries' homes. And they roared out of the hills where they had control into the open hinterland, where, of course, they couldn't survive because of the enormous air and firepower and mobility of the Americans. Came out, kicked them in the shins, ran back, and then reaped all the benefits. And, of course, that, of course, was the beginning of the end. From 1968, the America's will to win went down, and, of course, we then started to withdraw our own forces, starting from 68 and then coming out in 72. And I must say, to a plug for my unit, the Australian Army Training Team, first in and last out.
Well, obviously things are now beginning to happen here, Peter.
They're a little behind,
yes.
But what are we seeing now then, Clive?
It looks like the beginning of the parade at last.
Yes, well, one of the good things about this too is that the nurses are being given a very, very very important pride of place. If you remember the Anzac Day, every time the nurses come by, there's almost anyone who's ever served in the services stands up when an Army nurse or an Air Force or a Naval nurse marches by. And it's good to see the generosity of the spirit of these march organisers, who've included some of the World War II people as well. They've included their disabled. They have looked after their disabled, perhaps as no other group of veterans has ever done. And there you can see the outline of the shape of South Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam now reunified. You can see their Kar Mau Peninsula at the bottom, Vung Tau, which was where the Australians were, just above that little indentation on the right. And of course the banners being very proudly borne by members of the Australian Regular Army, and we're going to see a lot of them today because it's their bicentennial program. I think we've got some World War II veterans there as well. But again, as I say, this is an all-embracing thing. There's been no arguments at all. War correspondents have been properly accepted for the very important role they played. Nurses, Salvation Army, everymans, everybody who served in Vietnam has been welcomed with open arms.
That's right. The parade being led here, as you see, by the Vietnam veterans who returned disabled, some of them blinded, but they're clearly in great cheer today. It's the men whose services resulted in a lifelong disability. For them, perhaps more than all others in this parade, this is the moment in which the cost that they paid in service to their country is justifiably recognised. Today they travel proudly with their mates, acknowledging the cheers and greetings of the crowd.
Well, it's beginning now, and of course this parade couldn't have been organised without the full cooperation of the Australian Regular Army, which is taking a very important part in the bicentennial programme in next year, and also the Army Reserve, which is now fully part of an integrated force. But of course many of those Army Reserve, CMF as they were, went up there as observers, and we'll see them later. But I think full tribute to the way in which the government, long last perhaps, and the way in which the forces have wholeheartedly put their support behind the Vietnam veterans on this, their own march, 25 years after. 25 years after the first Australian ever went to Vietnam in, I think, July 1962.
I think we can see some of the Vietnam veterans themselves coming through now, Peter, on the screen.
I think we get some of those World War II ones who've gone past. We're now seeing, yes, you can see the very distinctive medal ribbons. Very distinctive Vietnam ribbons. So you can see that white and green, the star, which is the Vietnam Award, Vietnamese Award, which is the most distinctive one. Well then, Bob, what about there? What are we seeing there?
Yes, indeed. We have the veterans of Vietnam. First of all, the Caraboos, followed by the Huey Iroquois helicopters, which served with the RAF in Vietnam. The Caribou itself was designed as a specific short takeoff and landing aircraft, which was on its way back, in fact, on delivery from America to Australia, from Canada to Australia, in fact, and well-known Wallaby Airlines became a regular and reliable service in Vietnam to all servicemen.
Oh, more than reliable. I remember those the Wallaby Airlines, Bob. The Special Forces outpost, you get an Australian Wallaby airline going into a pocket handkerchief, and they'd suddenly drive off the end of a cliff, and they'd disappear for about 5 minutes as they were trying to gain height down a valley, and then reappear again. It was a wonderful flight.
Now, as you see, we're looking right down George Street, right to the top there. You can just see them coming to our camera range now in the Land Rovers. The Vietnam veterans who returned disabled, and indeed some of them blinded. Mines must have caused some horrific injuries there.
Regrettably, most of the casualties came from mines, in that mines were laid to try and keep some of the Viet Cong away from other areas of the province, Phuoc Toi province, which the Australians operated. Unfortunately, no barrier is a barrier unless it's covered by fire, and some of the Viet Cong came along and picked up those mines, and of course we suffered some very heavy and horrendous casualties. Plus, of course, the jumping jack mines, which everyone learned to fear and dread because they'd jump up to about waist height and explode, and they caused so many of our casualties. Of course, the idea is, as always, you know, it's dreadful to get so clinical, but in World War II, World War I, a machine gun was always aimed at a man's waist because, of course, there was the psychological problem, but also a wound there kept him in hospital for a much longer time.
That's right, and took two or three other combat men out of combat to carry them back.
The idea was to maim somebody rather than to kill them because you then place that additional demand upon your hospital services.
Clive, I noticed we've got a lot of people here lining the streets. The dawn service this morning certainly had a large crowd, I believe in excess of 5,000 people.
That's right. One of the figures mentioned was 7,000 people at the dawn service this morning, which was absolutely magnificent, and I think a greater figure than we normally get on Anzac Day. But I think there's a very special feeling about this day here in Sydney for the people lining the streets, and I'm sure for the Vietnam veterans. This is recognition at last, coming 15 years after their return.
Well, 25 years too late, but again, on this occasion, the veterans are a few minutes late. We're still waiting for them to come into view, but it does give an opportunity to give that overall idea of what it's all about and the enormous amount of public support which we're seeing.
Yes.
And of course, it was such a harrowing war because it wasn't a front where you could be at a front as in World War I or perhaps fighting very hard in World War II in the Western Desert. It was a continuous 24-hour stress. And when they came back, they not only came back as the scapegoats of an unpopular war, but there was an enormous amount of mental stress which is only just now coming out. And we've still got the unresolved problem of Agent Orange. And as a result, large numbers went bush. They just went into the bush. And this is the first time some of these people have come out. And they're calling them closet Vietnam veterans. The first time after 25 years that they've now come out and demonstrated that they are proud to be Vietnam veterans, and they're proud of the fact that that enormous crowd, you see, they're far bigger than the Anzac Day crowd.
That's right, and listen to this applause.
It really is. It's quite wonderful.
Well, I think it's a measure of the increasing interest which the people of Sydney in particular have taken in this parade in the last week or so. It's been quite encouraging to see the way that they've rallied around, and indeed this morning we see them very enthusiastic.
And of course they're represented by the many hundreds of thousands of others around Australia watching this through ABC television, and the people lining the streets here representing them and representing them very well indeed.
I believe, Clive, in fact, that we've just had a police reference that there's about 110,000 people altogether already assembled in Sydney to watch the
magnificent. And young people in the preponderance here.
Well, of course, that's the thing we see now on the Anzac Day. As Rob said, there was an increasing interest, and all of them holding Australian flags. It's always wonderful to see.
And again, lots of young people.
Again, as we wait, it might be time to pay tribute to the New South Wales Police Force, Clive.
Yes. Well, of course, you'd expect a few today, as this is, after all, the first of its kind.
Vietnamese, many Vietnamese refugees came here, and of course, as Peter Polton, the organiser, once said in an interview, I think last week, he said, somebody said, was it all worth it? And he said, well, I can't answer that. He said, but all I can say is that so many Vietnamese are fleeing from that country to live
you saw the Vietnamese there on camera a moment ago. Some 600, I think it is, Vietnamese have come from all over the country, from all over Australia to be here today. And a big group, I understand, from across the Tasman in New Zealand. And of course, we'll have New Zealanders marching here today too.
Oh, indeed. You see, it was an Anzac organisation. They were brigaded together in the headquarters Australian Task Force and provided gun support, invaluable gun support.
And a whole host of countries. There are Filipinos, Thais. They were all at the dawn service this morning.
Yes, Koreans. I think they're all being represented here. And it's good to see once again, as in our Anzac Day marches, the mounted police of the New South Wales Police, the oldest formed unit.
You were talking before about the New Zealanders coming across. Of course, point to remember, as we'll see later on this morning during the parade, the New Zealanders were very closely integrated, particularly in some of the Army battalions, Anzac battalion and so on.
Oh yes, because as I say, they provided gun support, and there's simply no difference because most people went to the same Dundee military academy, at least in the army, and most people trained together, and it's just a normal thing. And despite the present problems of ANZUS, we still have, luckily, these very, very close bilateral links.
From the Air Force point of view, we also had a lot of close collaboration too, both in the forward air control area.
Look at that. Welcome home, Dickers. Isn't that great?
Isn't it wonderful? Sorry, Bob.
I was just saying that there was a close collaboration on the Air Force side too with the Kiwis. We had quite a few Kiwis serve with us in Phan Rang as well.
Well, once again, you can see coming on the screen now the beginnings of this parade, the Vietnam Veterans Banner. Vietnam, 1962, 1973. And that 73 is, I think, covers the fact that whilst most of them came out by 72, some members of the Australian Army training team did stay on in Phuoc Toi province and then came out in 1973.
Yes, and of course this telecast is going via satellite to a great many other areas all over Australia, outlying areas through 288 ABC television stations. It's going to New Guinea and the Gulf of Carpentaria, and I understand even over to New Zealand. I'm not sure about that point.
Well, I imagine they'll be very interested in this, of course.
Yes, the east coast of New Zealand's taking us as well.
It's an interesting sight to see all those Australian flags down there. There's a very enthusiastic crowd waving them. Casting your mind back 20 years or so, there weren't quite so many in the streets then, I think.
Well, I think I've been doing Anzac Day parades for about 11 years now, and I've never seen such a large crowd, and I've never seen so many Australian flags. Really, this is a wonderful day. We've waited for this for so long. And it's now happening at long last. And it's going to be a very long parade, but of course these young lads can take it because they went in 1962, the average age then, say 21, they came out in 72, again the average age 21. The average age will be about 40 to 45, and these men of course now approaching middle age, head of families and taking their place in the running of this country. They're moving into the Return Services League, they're moving into the professions, and in much the same way that the mass returning army of World War II, to a large extent, took command of this country, so are these. And there, of course, you can see an excited, I think, Defence Minister, Mr. Kim Beazley, looking there.
Yes, the veterans get close to us, we can hear the swell of noise from the crowd. They're really quite enthusiastic.
You can see the distinctive medal ribbons there, the one issued by the Australian government and the one issued by the Vietnamese. And the Prime Minister stands up as the Vietnam veterans march by. What a wonderful moment. We've waited a very, very long time for that. This could be a fairly long march today, Clive, as we're starting a little bit late. And we estimate there's something like 20 to 25,000 were in the domain this morning being organised, which may explain the delay.
I don't think anybody out there is going to be bored for a second.
I don't think so, not with these coming by.
I see that sign there says, welcome, it's about time. Well, indeed, it is time, isn't it?
And of course, the Vietnamese flags with the Republic of South Vietnam flag, which we just saw. Now here we are once again. We're now getting into the main part of this parade. We've got the New South Wales Mounted Police, which always do such a fine job in these. And behind them, which we'll see in just a moment as they come into closer view, we've got the Light Horse Association. Now, of course, these are not the original Light Horsemen. We've got so very, very few of those left to us. But it's an association which keeps the traditions, the uniforms, and all the old ideas of a unit which goes back to the beaches of Gallipoli. And their presence today, I think, gives this link between World War I, Anzac, Gallipoli, and Vietnam.
I think the police have got an easier job there this morning, Clive, than they've had for some time with one of these sorts of crowds and parades.
Yes.
Seem to be breaking forward.
The crush is getting there. There's an enormous number of people watching this parade, lining the streets.
And there you can see the Vietnamese flag, the Republic of South Vietnam flag. That's that yellow one with the red stripes across. And what
Isn't that a great reception?
Oh, it's heartwarming.
Excellent.
It looks as they're breaking the barriers and coming onto the street.
Yes, perhaps I was premature in my remark about the police.
They might have a little bit of a problem
work
holding it back. It's always a fine sight. New South Wales Mounted Police. Actually, we do have some Vietnam veterans. In fact, a fairly large number of Vietnam veterans in the New South Wales Police, but of course none of those there. We can't see the medals being worn by them. But if you look around your street corners, you suddenly see a lot of those younger policemen wearing the Vietnam medals. Okay, well, I think now behind the light horse, which will take us back to Gallipoli, you're going to see one of the most moving things I think we've ever seen on television for a long time. It's a group of people, both men and women, serving members, Vietnam veterans, and the wives and families of some of those who served, carrying the flags, 500 flags in a massed phalanx, each one representing the 496 who were killed. The 496 servicemen and the 4 civilians who never came back. And each one of those flags, of course, represents a young Australian. They didn't choose that war, they didn't declare it. They just did their duty as they saw it. And here we can see now coming up the Roll of Honour. Each one of those flags, of course, represents a young serviceman. $500 young men who did their duty as they saw it. They were not marching today, but personified by those flags.
It's very moving, Peter.
It's something I never want to see again. Each one of them should have been back here enjoying the enormous advantages of this great country. Badco, BC. Really nothing can be said as you watch this list of names go by. Each one of them, each flag, a young Australian soldier.
Well, hearts go out to their relatives.
In fact, some of those...
Mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, friends.
There are mothers and fathers and sons and daughters carrying the flags. What this parade's all about. Because each one of those 500 have now come home. And they'll never ever be forgotten because this parade will go on. And each one of those flags, which will be given to the relatives of those who never came back, will still march with those soldiers. And each one of those soldiers there is going to remember those who fought alongside them and who didn't come back and didn't get the benefits. Drums of the Royal Marines. They're coming. Still they're coming. Young men who never came back for this war they didn't choose, war they didn't declare, and war they fought professionally and well, whilst people behind were not delivering their supplies, not delivering their mail, and condemning them and demonstrating against them and treating them as the scapegoats of an unpopular war. And still they come. Still those names come up. If you ever demonstrate against a war in future, think of those kids who were over there fighting that war, because they were kids, 21-year-old men. Remember, as we come to the end of this this tragic list that it wasn't just Australians who were there. We had some 37 New Zealanders, and I think that enormous sacrifice could be summed up better by these words from David McNichol, a poem which Clive has got now. It's called The Epitaph of a Soldier.
Yes, Epitaph for a Soldier, which goes, "Build me no monument should my turn come. Please do not weep for me and waste your tears. Write not my name on honour rolls of fame to crumble with man's memory through the years. Wear no dark clothes, speak in no saddened voice, seeking rare virtues which didn't exist. Just let me lie under the cool, sweet earth and sleep in peace, where I'll not be missed. I ask one thing, that in still far-off days, someone who knew me should in their daily round suddenly pause, caught by some sight or sound, some glance, some phrase, some trick of memory's ways which brings me to his mind. Then I shall wait eager with hope, perhaps to hear how great if he were with us still. And then at the end, all that I wish for, just he was my friend."
And there's nurses now, of course, members of the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps. First went to Vietnam in '67. There were 2,398 wounded, and they were well looked after. They were well looked after, and they're led today by Colonel Espy. And of course, they head this march in pride of place of the nurses. And there we've got the Australian Army Training Team, the most highly decorated unit ever to leave Australia's shores. The Australian Army Training Team who went in 1962, 1972, first in and last out, led by Brigadier General Sarong, Ted Sarong, Uncle Ted if you want, who unfortunately isn't here with us today. But as Uncle Ted said, he's not here, but he's going to be in spirit. He perhaps doesn't approve of marching, but he said anyone who does has got his full support. And you can see too the presidential citation from the United States of America, and also the Vietnamese presidential citation, which are the mark of those who served in the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. So many of the names. There's Colonel McNamara carrying another generation with him there. The names come flooding back, the memories come flooding back. Remember these middle-aged men, they were actually at the sharp end. Warrant officers, sergeants in some cases, commanded battalions, commanded special forces outposts. And they did quite wonderfully. Some served in the Central Intelligence Agency. It'll take a long time before we fully know what all the members of this team did. And they can see a very smart, eyes wide, the Australian Army Training Team coming past now. Colonel McNamara, one of the commanders. I might say they're marching as well as they did when they were first formed at the Army Intelligence Centre in 1962.
That's a magnificent effort, Peter, this highly decorated, the most highly decorated Australian unit. What was it, 4 VCs, 2 DSOs, 3 OBEs, 6 MBEs, 6 MCs and 20 DCMs?
Indeed.
I can see the Navy banner coming in there for the Vung Tau Ferry, Peter, and you can hear the sounds of the RAN Support Command band striking up Hearts of Oak.
Well, of course, what a wonderful stirring sound. Well, I think we missed the commanders, actually. We do have an Army, Navy and Air Force commander. Who was leading the
that was Commander Bob Burns, George Medal for his activities in the Melbourne and the Evans collision, but he was the second leader of the clearance diving team the Navy put into Vietnam.
And who was Air Force?
Leading the Air Force was ex-Corporal Snow Coghlan, who featured in a helicopter rescue in Vietnam, and in fact was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal for that effort.
There we've got the leading placards for the Royal Australian Navy and the ships that served in Vietnam.
Sydney leads. Why is that?
Indeed. Sydney was the first one to go in 1965, made 22 trips, Clive. And now, there it is, HMAS Brisbane, I see. She was selected today to lead the DDGs, Vietnam 69 to 71, and a ship, of course, that I'm very proud of.
I think somehow we slipped by.
Well, I'll interrupt for a moment. You can see just in front of the banner there, Rear Admiral Ron Calder. He's marching proudly with all his Vietnam medals, member of the ship's company.
We missed, I think, the March commander, General Pearson, Major General Pearson, who slipped by us, and also we didn't see the Tri-Service Guard of Honour. I haven't seen it so far, but of course they may be out of order.
No, I think they're slightly out of order this morning. We didn't get them. Well, the Royal Australian Navy, of course, served in Vietnam, 65 to 72. Great skill, great dedication. Logistical transport of men and equipment between Australia and Vietnam. In fact,
and just coming onto the screen now, Clive, you can see, well, I can see behind the pipe band Captain David Farthing, and on the right, the man who took the ship first into Vietnam, Rear Admiral Guy Griffiths. He already had the DSC before he went, and he won the DSO up there. He was an excellent commander.
We've also missed, I think, the VC winners. Mr. Keith Payne, VC, should be marching this morning, and Dasher Wheatley, George Wheatley, this is being represented by his son, and Mrs. Helen O'Hagan, the niece of Warrant Officer Simpson, and also Miss Kim Badcoe marching.
And with Perth coming through now, you can see the placard indicating that HMAS Hobart's team are coming up well. Vice Admiral Sir David Leach just passing there.
I must say, Rob, they're marching well, the sailors.
Well, indeed they do. Indeed they do. Smart bunch. Max Solomon coming through on camera, I can see. Ah, here comes Vendetta. She was the only Australian-built destroyer ever to serve in Vietnam. Did one trip under the command of Eric Johnson, who's now the Administrator of the Northern Territory. They look a pretty cheerful bunch for sailors marching up a street in Sydney on a Saturday morning. I think they can rightly be proud of what they did there.
I'm not sure if we saw the Navy March Leader Commander Robert James Burns, did we? He's the officer in charge of the 2nd
No, we didn't see him
Diving
go
Team. We missed him. Sorry about that.
Team coming in here, camera now, Clive. It's Clearance Diving Team 3. They were a small group. Only 49 divers went to Vietnam. Very dangerous jobs they had to perform. They were the most highly decorated unit the Navy had. Of those 49 people, they got 29 honours, awards, medals for bravery and so on. A fine bunch that did a very, very difficult job.
We've got to remember, too, that this was a combined arms service. It was a combined arms operation. Everyone was so reliant on everybody else. The Army relied implicitly upon the Navy as their way to have transport, and they relied upon the Air Force for their ground support.
And here we have coming in camera the Navy's helicopter flight in Vietnam. They were integrated into a United States Army team. Worked there very well. They took most casualties of any of the Navy contingents that went to Vietnam. And as a matter of interest, I mentioned Captain David Farthing a few minutes ago, leading the Hobart team with Admiral Griffiths. He won the DSC as one of the command and control pilots in the helicopter flight.
Yes, and the roll of honour, of course, in the REN helicopter flight to Vietnam was Lieutenant Commander Patrick John Vickers, Lieutenant Anthony Austin Casadio, Petty Officer O'Brien, Cedric Phillips, Acting Sub-Lieutenant Anthony Jeffrey Havlin, seating Aircraftman Noel Irwin Ship. These men.
Here's another interesting one, Peter. You were mentioning about the combined arms and everybody getting together in this joint approach to warfare. There's a case where the RAN supplied helicopters to 9 Squadron of the RAAF for the activities that they performed in support of the Australian Army Task Force.
Well, in fact, Rod, they supplied people and served with the 9 Squadron. In fact, it was nostalgic last week to notice that in Canberra, 3 Iroquois helicopters flew over Black Mountain Tower to, in fact, notify that the aircraft had finally paid off from the Navy helicopter flight.
A sad day.
Oh, here we are. We're now coming up to the Army, of course, is now through. The reason why we did have such a small Navy contingent, of course, the Navy played such an important role, firstly in the ferrying of troops, and then secondly in providing offshore gun line support. You know, it couldn't have been done without the Navy, but it was primarily a land war. And we've seen, first off, they're just stopping for a moment, headquarters company of the Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam. Now, all of this stemmed from a decision by the government to increase its assistance to the Republic of Vietnam with the 1st Battalion RAR, Royal Australian Regiment, with logistic support elements going over there in May and June '65. That was after the training team was there. Supporting artillery, armoured personnel carriers, engineers and Army light aircraft arrived a little bit later. But they had to be commanded. And firstly, they were with 173, the United States Airborne Brigade. But then we set up our own headquarters, Headquarters Australian Army Force Vietnam. May 65, May 66, then it changed to Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam, then to the Australian Army Assistance Group Vietnam, with, of course, the Task Force Command in Phuoc Toi, where the Australians had complete carriage of the operations in Phuoc Toi, apart from the control of the Vietnamese effort, which was done by the Americans. And now we've got the 1st Australian Task Force, which was set up because the battalions went in there, firstly 1, then 2, then 3, and then, of course, came out in reverse order. But at the height, we had a full task force with complete supporting arms and logistics. And, of course, we had the support elements at Nui Dat. The commanders now serve of Australian Force Vietnam, firstly Major General MacDonald, then General Hay, General Fraser, General Dunstan, and then Brigadier Geddes with the Australian Army Group. As the Defence and Employment Platoon, of course, no headquarters is secure without its own Defence and Employment Platoon. And these people, by no means in a rear area, these people defended that headquarters. There you are, Headquarters 1 Australian Task Force, with their little banner being carried by one of those who was disabled in that war. And I'm told there's quite a fight for the privilege of pushing the wheelchairs of those who in fact were disabled. The Headquarters 1st Task Force had the cash office, the Detachment Army Force Vietnam Cash Office, the police from one section, Pro Company, the Australian Reinforcement Unit, and the Defence and Employment Platoon. It was called Hawk Force.
And that sound you can hear, the music coming up, is the police band.
And I believe that was just the Australian Logistics Support Group that went past before there, Peter.
Yes, ALSG, of course. You had your fighting force in Phuoc Toi, and at Nui Dat you had the Australian Logistics Support Group, which provided all of the support for the main force. And again, it's much the same as any other war. Everybody plays the most important role. It doesn't matter what their particular task is. A man who's handling ammunition in a rear area is as important as the man who actually pulls the land.
Pardon me interrupting there. That is the ambulance band. Those checkered caps got us in the first instance, but that's the ambulance band with their fine contribution to this Vietnam Reunion Day.
Well, they're certainly playing very well.
It's indicative too of the number of ladies who are marching in this parade. Armoured Corps now. We've gone through the headquarters. We've gone through the army.
Lorraine Bailey's there.
Lorraine Desmond, I remember her coming up in Van Ryn giving us a welcome show.
She was almost the Vera Lynn of that.
She was indeed, Clark. We remember.
Quite sad, only disbelieving. Someone's marching back once more. Someone's marching back once more.
And that concludes our coverage of the Vietnam Veterans March from Martin Place in Sydney.